There's a narrative that has been carried by mostly leftists, but a scant few on the right too, that if America acts in its own interests, it risks war. A corollary to this narrative is that if America does something, it's always wrong. But if another country does the same thing, it's A-OK. This mindset has led to a dangerous reduction in standards, lethality, and effectiveness in our nation's readiness and defense posture. President Trump's team is trying to remedy that, but they are getting resistance from those aligned with enemy nations. Communist China has a policy of unrestricted warfare against the United States. How many of you knew that? It means there is no boundary they won't cross to see our country destroyed. This threat has been all but ignored by influential members of both political parties, and this policy is literally killing Americans, and not in small measures. Look at the fentanyl crisis, for example. Via open borders, Joe Biden left our country vulnerable to poison produced by his good friends and benefactors in communist China. And Americans are dead because of it, a lot of them. Reports indicate Biden wasn't alone in ignoring the China threat. Names like McConnell, Schiff, Kerry, and others colluded to offer us up, our citizens up, as sacrificial lambs. A few days ago, the Washington Post, agents of anti-Americanism, ran this absurd headline, quote, "The mysterious drop in fentanyl seizures on the U.S.-Mexico border," end quote. That's right. The Washington Post, staffed with the best leftists in fake news, can't think of one thing that led to decreased China-sourced fentanyl into the United States. The Bezos WASHPO, to them, it's a mystery. Caroline Levitt addressed the so-called mystery at yesterday's press briefing.
This administration's strong border policies are the reason there has been a decrease in fentanyl trafficking. His strengthened relationship with Mexican President Sheinbaum and all of the measures he has been taking to deter illegal human and drug trafficking at our United States southern border is the reason for plummeting fentanyl seizures at the U.S. border. There is nothing mysterious about that, and we'd like to see the Washington Post update their headline accordingly. This is clearly trying to intentionally manipulate the minds of the Americans.
Servicing who, I wonder? And where President Trump is disrupting China's flow of drugs via their Mexican drug cartel partners into the U.S., the scope of this attack on us as part of China's war against us is still not being addressed in government and most of the media. This war is no mystery to my guests, president of the Government Accountability Institute, host of the Drill Down podcast, and author of Blood Money, Peter Schweitzer, along with author of The Coming Collapse of China and the Great U.S.-China Tech War, Gordon Chang. Gentlemen, welcome to you both. Peter, I want to begin with you. Your book, Blood Money, you exposed China's policy of unrestricted warfare against the United States. You also outlined how many politicians in Washington have known about this war and, for various reasons, have run cover for the Chi-Coms, even despite hundreds of thousands of dead Americans. In your book, you note how China adopted their love of using drugs in warfare after Great Britain and France launched the opioid wars against China in the 1800s. Tell me, how did China jump from blaming France and England for the Opium War that was catastrophic to Imperial China to blaming and launching a drug war against the United States?
Well, they saw the opium wars in the 19th century as really taking them. At the beginning of the 19th century, they were a major growing, expanding power. By the end of that century, they were weakened and divided. And the estimates are that 25% of the Chinese population was addicted to opium. That's something that resonates deeply in Chinese history and Chinese thought. And when you look at the fentanyl crisis today, I think the biggest misnomer is that somehow this is essentially caused by the Mexican drug cartels. They are absolutely the junior partners in this relationship. The Sinaloa cartel, they're kind of the kings of fentanyl. They were introduced to fentanyl by Chinese organized crime networks that are linked to the CCP. And if you look at every link in the chain, people know about the precursor chemicals to create fentanyl, but we also know that there are 2,000 Chinese nationals living in northern Mexico who actually create the fentanyl from the precursors. We know that the pill presses that the cartels use to create this poison, those pill presses are provided by the Chinese companies, and they're sold at cost to the drug cartels. We know that much of the money laundering for the drug cartels goes through Chinese state-owned banks. So fentanyl is a Chinese operation in which the drug cartels are the junior partners, and I applaud the Trump administration for focusing on it. They've created a special tariff on China's activities related to fentanyl, because when you're presented with this kind of threat, it's not as if the United States is going to return the favor and poison Chinese citizens in return. So you have to come up with something that is short of kinetic war, but at least costs China something for this terrible conduct that they're engaging in.
Yeah, folks, and this goes back many decades. I mean, they did it with heroin, they did it with marijuana, very potent marijuana, and now they're into the fentanyl. I want to pivot here, Gordon. A new China virus variant, NB 1.81, is popping up. The press pushing so-called health officials, pushing masks and vaccine boosters again. We have never dealt with China's role in purposely unleashing the pandemic on the world. Here's Trump's National Security Council official, General Robert Spalding, in 2020 on this show.
The Wuhan people knew about the human-to-human transmission in December. I guarantee that Xi Jinping knew about it back then, and we know for a fact that the WHO knew on the 7th of January. So, yes, this is entirely the Chinese Communist Party. That whether it actually was released on purpose, that I can't tell you. But what I can tell you is a pandemic was created by the Chinese Communist Party for letting those 5 million people leave Wuhan to the four corners of the earth.
Gordon, China's actions, suspected and confirmed, are actions of an enemy, are they not?
Well, they certainly are. I mean, People's Daily, which is the most authoritative publication in China, in May 2019 carried a landmark editorial that declared a quote-unquote people's war on us. And that is a phrase which has great resonance in Communist Party history. So we know how they treat us. And by the way, in 2023, PLA Daily, which is the main propaganda organ of the Chinese military, actually defined that term for us, and that is total war. You talk about unrestricted warfare. Chris, you mentioned 9/11. In Unrestricted Warfare, which is a slim book from 1999 by two Chinese Air Force colonels, they actually talk about bin Laden hitting the United States. That's 2 years before 9/11.
Well, Peter, they're at it again. The FBI investigating Chinese operatives tied to the CCP at the University of Michigan who allegedly smuggled a biological pathogen into the United States. It's a fungus designed to taint America's food supply. Peter, is this part, in your view, of China's unrestricted warfare against the United States?
Yeah, I think it absolutely is. And look, let's add another book to that description, a book published in China in 2012 titled Disintegration Warfare, which is along the same lines as unrestricted warfare. The notion is we are going to figure out, the CCP is going to figure out ways in which we can harm and damage the United States that is short of a kinetic war. In other words, we don't want to actually launch missiles or have aircraft carriers launching aircraft and bombing each other. But we are going to think of ways in which we can disintegrate or fragment American society. And certainly the health system is one way to do that. Fentanyl is some way to do that. I talk in my book, Blood Money, about this problem with the Glock switches. These are small devices that turn a Glock handgun into a machine gun. China was exporting those to criminal gangs in the United States beginning in 2018, leading to a surge in criminal gangs having massive firepower against law enforcement. So I think the assumption we have to operate under is when these sorts of things happen, and Gordon writes about this, I think, very well in his recent book, we have to assume that there is probably official CCP sanction behind it, because the notion that you're going to have senior officials connected to the government or connected to the establishment in China kind of freelancing on this stuff just does not make any sense. So yeah, it is part of a Chinese concerted strategy to undermine us.
Yes, and folks, just keep in mind, your own American government knows all about everything we're talking about. Gordon, Reuters reporting that China militarizing what I call the Woody Islands, because that's the biggest fake island in the chain here. 2 long-range military bombers were spotted here last week. Dictator Xi Jinping promised China wasn't militarizing this chain of artificial islands, that it was illegally occupying. But back in 2015, he promised that. But you and I know, Gordon, that leftists lie. Now President Trump says China has begun cheating on this temporary trade agreement. Gordon, how many more bricks have to fall on America's head before we take concrete actions to defend ourselves against communist China?
I wish I knew the answer to that question, Chris, because clearly the Chinese did cheat on the May 12th agreement. They had promised to remove non-tariff barriers that had been put in place after April 2nd. So they clearly have not complied. You know, and by the way, you know, what Peter just said, these Glock switches, you know, we found some of them coming into Minnesota just after the George Floyd protests. So this is part of a concerted campaign to attack the United States. And it's across the board, whether we're talking about fungus, we're talking about Glock switches, counterfeit currency, fentanyl, you name it. This is part of a plan.
Total warfare. Peter, you explore an aspect in your book why so many American politicians in both parties are just looking the other way as brick after brick falls on Americans' heads. What did you uncover in your research?
Well, that a lot of political figures are willing to look the other way if they can get paid. And China's very effective at this. They call it elite capture, and it's pretty brilliant. I mean, in other words, instead of going head to head with a country, if you can effectively pay off some of their senior officials to go soft on you, that's a great strategy. And they primarily do it by enriching family members. They know it's a little, too on the nose to shovel buckets of cash to the politician themselves, so they give it to Hunter Biden, or they set up special deals with Mitch McConnell's in-laws and his wife, where they benefit, and the numbers and the level of profit is enormous. So it's very enticing, and a lot of these deals happened at a time when the consensus in Washington was essentially that we need to engage with China. That was the word, and engagement was effectively give them access to our capital markets, our technology, and if we do so, they'll become more like us. Well, that has failed over the course of 30 years. There were a few voices out there like Gordon's who were warning against this, but the massive consensus in Washington, D.C. was the route to go. So they convinced themselves, the political class, that they could do good and do well at the same time. And let's be clear, what the Chinese are looking for from American officials is a phrase they generally use is big help with a little bad mouth. In other words, they know that Joe Biden, they know that Mitch McConnell occasionally has to talk about the China threat. They have to talk about human rights violations. That's the little bad mouth. But if they give them what they really want, which is unfettered access to technology, to our capital markets, and to our commercial public market, they are very, very happy with these elected officials. And it has worked out to be a very effective strategy for them.
No more relevant has this concept we developed here on the Chris Salcedo Show. We have two political divides in this country now. It's not Republican and Democrat. It's America first and America last. Full stop. Gordon Chang and Peter Schweizer, gentlemen, your time, your expertise, and your research very much valued. Thank you very much.